In my video about the flood, I stated my opinion that there was an ancient pre-flood advanced global human civilization whose architectural traces can be found all over the planet. In this video, I will examine some of these more or less well-known architectural artifacts through this lens. Before I give specific examples, if humanity were to die out today, then in a few thousand years most of the wooden, steel, and concrete buildings would crumble to dust. However, our buildings made of stone could potentially survive, and this is probably just as true for us as it was for the Antediluvians. Hence the buildings being presented now, they were made exclusively of stone. Anyway, let's start the video. And where else could we begin other than Egypt? According to mainstream academic science, the Great Pyramid of Giza was built 4,600 years ago by Cheops, or in another writing, by the pharaoh Khufu. According to antique sources, when the Romans conquered Egypt 2,000 years ago, its population was around 6 to 7 million people. We do not have accurate information about how people lived in Egypt 2,600 years before that, when the Great Pyramid of Giza was built. Estimates put their population around 1 or 2 million people, which could have been 5 to 10% of the world population at the time. The Great Pyramid of Giza is estimated to be made up of around 2,300,000 stone blocks, and according to mainstream academia, the construction of it took nearly 20 years. Well, if this is true, it means that 13 stone blocks of at least 2 tons each had to be mined, cut to size, taken from the quarry to the pyramid, and put in place every hour, including every night. But what if they didn't work on the pyramid after sunset? I suppose it can be quite dangerous to move those 2 to 3 ton stones without being able to see anything. Also, the workers probably needed sleep. That would mean that instead of 13, 20, or maybe even 26 stones would have to be placed every hour, which comes out to 1 every 3 minutes. How realistic is that? The weight of the stones used for the Great Pyramid is estimated to be around 6 million tons. How realistic is it that a society with Bronze Age technology would be able to extract 3 to 6 tons of limestone for each of its inhabitants, including infants and elderly people, for just one single architectural project, which is a project built only for the purpose of one man's vanity? And all of this just for the construction of the Great Pyramid. How much extra investment of time and energy could the other 2 pyramids have required? Moreover, how many workers' continuous employment is required for such an architectural project? According to the ancient Greek writer Herodotus, 100,000 slaves worked on the Great Pyramid. As a ratio, 100,000 people in a population of 2 million accounts for about a third or a quarter of the male population aged between 20 and 40. Of course, today's historians do not take Herodotus's numbers seriously, at least when it comes to the number of workers employed. In 1999, the Egyptologist Mark Lehner, along with several of his colleagues, estimated that an average of 11,000 workers could have constantly worked on the building of the Great Pyramid, and around 40,000 workers at peak times. Of course, Mark Lehner and his colleagues were not architects, but Wisław Kosinski was. In his 1970 manifesto, the Polish architect Kosinski estimated that 360,000 people could have worked on the pyramid at its peak. Needless to say, that number is completely unthinkable if the Great Pyramid was built by the ancient Egyptians with less than a population of 2 million people. But for some reason, I would listen more to an architect's opinion when it comes to architecture than to a historian's. Speaking of historians, mainstream academia claims that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built by the pharaoh Khufu, aka Cheops, for 2 reasons. The first reason being none other than Herodotus's writings about Egypt. Herodotus writes that after the righteous pharaoh Ramisseum, the tyrant Khufu came to power, who closed the temples, banned rituals, forced all Egyptians into slavery, and then built a huge road from the stones of the quarries of Libya and the Arabian mountains. If I understand the text correctly, this road leads to the Giza Plateau. The construction of this road and the buildings around the Giza Plateau took about 10 years according to the writings of Herodotus, while the construction of the Great Pyramid took another 20 years. Now let me read a quote from the writings of Herodotus. "And so evil a man was Cheops that, needing money, he put his own daughter in a brothel and made her charge a fee, how much they did not say. She did as her father told her, but was disposed to leave a memorial of her own, and asked of each coming to her that he give one stone, and of these stones they said the pyramid was built that stands midmost of the three, over against the Great Pyramid." End of the quote. All of this was told to Herodotus by the locals, and to be honest, it does sound more like a highly colored tale from locals than a reliable historical source. Let's keep in mind that Herodotus is closer to us in time than to the alleged builders of the pyramid. I find it humorous that modern Egyptologists base their pyramid construction timeline on this account, but let that be their problem. I ask the question, why would Pharaoh Khufu build a tomb for himself that would take 20 years? What if he dies in the process? There's absolutely no guarantee that this grave will be completed after his death. Due to the construction difficulties mentioned above, personally, I believe that Bronze Age societies simply could not have been able to build a structure like the pyramids of Giza, and for what purpose the ancient Egyptians would have built them anyway. I cannot believe that anyone would build something like this just to serve as a tomb for a single man. I would also like to note that no mummy has ever been found inside of a pyramid, and as far as I know, the mummies of Egyptian pharaohs were only and exclusively found in the Valley of the Kings. Look how beautifully the walls are painted and decorated in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, while in the corridors of the pyramids there is nothing on the walls, and the inner passageways themselves do not even look like they were designed for human traffic. They don't even have stairs, and the passage that leads to the alleged burial chamber has a 45-degree slope. Speaking of murals, the graffiti shown in the picture was discovered in 1837 by Richard Howard Weiss, an English soldier, politician, and Egyptologist, after using a very special blasting method to gain access to one of the previously unexplored chambers of the pyramid. The graffitis in the chamber contained the name of Pharaoh Khufu more than a dozen times, thus conclusively proving that the pyramid was indeed built by Pharaoh Khufu. Unless, of course, Howard, after exploding himself into the previously unexplored chamber, scribbled them to increase the value of his discovery. But we all know that an English politician would never lie or forge, as the very high moral level they represent is known all across the world. Despite this, it is somewhat suspicious to me that inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, no graffiti related to Pharaoh Khufu or any graffiti has ever been found. But here comes Howard Weiss, and after a little bit of blasting, he immediately finds a bunch of it. The Wikipedia page mentions two interesting things about Howard Weiss. One of them is that at the time there was a scandal he was involved in, according to which he bribed voters to gain office. The second one is that Weiss initially worked with an Italian Egyptologist named Giovanni Battista Caviglia, whom he later fired. Caviglia claimed that after he told Weiss that he believes that there is still an undiscovered chamber above the one discovered by Nathaniel Davidson in 1765 in the Great Pyramid, Weiss simply fired Caviglia from his team to claim the glory of the discovery for himself. But let's talk a little about the two other Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. The Pyramid of Khafre, the second largest at Giza, was built using an estimated 4,880,000 tons of stone, which is more than 80% of what was used for the Pyramid of Khufu, so even if it's not as large, it still represented almost as much of an economic investment as the Pyramid of Khufu. There is only one document attributing this pyramid to the pharaoh Khafre, and that is in the writings of Herodotus. According to official history, Khafre was Cheops's child. However, Herodotus writes that Khafre was Cheops's younger brother, and after his brother's death he became the pharaoh. The only problem with this is that according to Herodotus, Cheops reigned for 50 years and Khafre for 56 years, which means that the pharaoh Khafre was at least 106 years old when he died, but he was probably much more than that, which is not necessarily impossible, but rather hard to believe. Khafre was succeeded on the throne by Khufu's son, Mycarine or Menkaure, who was at least 56 years old at this point, if Herodotus's data is correct. However, according to the official science of history, he was actually not Khufu's son, but Khafre's, i.e., Khufu's grandson. I mention this to illustrate that the story recorded by Herodotus is probably not on stable footing in terms of historical authenticity. Officially, according to Herodotus, Menkaure built the smallest of the 3 great pyramids on the Giza plateau, but there is no other evidence for this, except what Herodotus heard from the locals during his trip to Egypt. By the way, Herodotus expresses his skepticism in his book about a couple of things that the locals told him. Here is an example. I quote, "But some tell the following story about the cow and their statues, that Mycerinus conceived a passion for his own daughter and then had intercourse with her against her will. And they say that afterwards the girl strangled herself from grief, and that he buried her in this cow, but that her mother cut off the hands of the attendants who had betrayed the daughter to her father, and that now their statues are in the same condition as the living women were. But this I believe to be a silly story, especially about the hands of the figures, for in fact we ourselves saw that the hands have fallen off through age and were lying at their feet even in my day." End of the quote. Regarding how many tons of stone were used to build Menkaure's pyramid, I couldn't find any official data, but the Reddit user Beta Key Takeaway estimates this number at 600,000 tons. In general, I'm quite skeptical about all kinds of information that appears on Reddit, but I didn't find anything else regarding this, so let's work with it. 600,000 tons compared to the 6 million tons of the Great Pyramid doesn't seem like much. If they could finish Khufu's pyramids in 20 years, then 2 years should be enough for a pyramid 1/10 the size, right? In comparison, Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, weighs around 500,000 tons, so it is 100,000 tons lighter than Menkaure's pyramid. Since the Burj Khalifa was built with modern technology, unlike Menkaure's pyramid, the builders needed only 5.5 years to build it. At least 12,000 people were working on the skyscraper at any given moment, which is a little more than Mark Lehner estimated how many people worked on the 10 times heavier Great Pyramid of Giza. Oh, and I lied earlier when I claimed that no mummy had ever been found inside of a pyramid, because in 1837, a British Egyptologist found a heavily rotted wooden sarcophagus in Menkaure's pyramid with the name of Pharaoh Menkaure written on it. Human bones were found in the sarcophagus, which were radiocarbon dated, and the result was that the skeleton was less than 2,000 years old. So the men to whom those bones belonged to died 2,500 years after the pyramid was built, if radiocarbon dating can be trusted. So the bones couldn't have belonged to Pharaoh Menkaure, which is a bit odd. You will never guess the name of the English Egyptologist who found the sarcophagus. His name was Howard Weiss. If I didn't know the impeccable character of English politicians, I would say that Howard Weiss lied if he claimed a random mummy he found in Egypt came from a pyramid, and that it was the pharaoh Menkaure's corpse. I think you can see how weak the official story is, that the pyramids were built as tombs for the pharaohs of the ancient Egyptians. So here we have this Bronze Age civilization with a maximum of only 2 million inhabitants, which successfully embarks on 3 huge architectural projects that are incomprehensible even to us, in order to have a grave for 3 people. And all of this is only supported by dubious stories recorded 2,500 years after the alleged construction, as well as by the work of an English con artist. It is absolutely clear to me that the ancient Egyptians could not have built the 3 great pyramids of Giza. The smaller ones may or may not have been built by them as part of a kind of cargo cult, but I wouldn't bet on that either. That's all I wanted to say about the Giza pyramids, but there are other pyramids elsewhere in Egypt. Let's take, for example, the bent pyramid of Sneferu. According to mainstream academia, Sneferu was the father of Pharaoh Khufu, and he was the one who built the first pyramids. According to historians, although, to be completely fair, fewer and fewer historians believe in this theory, the bending of the pyramid is the result of the builders making a mistake during the design, and the pyramid would not have been able to support its own weight so they were forced to correct it. The assumption that those who built the bent pyramid did not know what they were doing is simply absurd. This pyramid was officially built more than 4,600 years ago. Today, they don't build buildings that can last 1,000 years. Skyscrapers that were built in the last 100 years collapse for no reason, as if someone blew them up. But if it is so clear that this pyramid looks the way it was designed, why was it assumed that the pyramid was botched? Well, the fact is that, according to academia, Pharaoh Sneferu built not one, but 3 pyramids. These are in chronological order: the Majdum Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, and finally the Red Pyramid. I have a question. Exactly how many burial places does a single individual need? According to official history, Sneferu first built the Majdum Pyramid, but he was not satisfied with it, so he started building a new pyramid, which became the Bent Pyramid. But because they messed up during the construction, a third pyramid became necessary, which became the Red Pyramid, which has the usual pyramid shape which can be seen in Giza. I have a question. If Sneferu built the Red Pyramid because they couldn't finish the Bent Pyramid at the original angle, then why did they even bother to finish the Bent Pyramid at all? And the Bent Pyramid is not a small structure. All 3 pyramids built by Sneferu are bigger than Menkare's pyramid on the Giza plateau. In fact, more stone was used for the 3 pyramids built by Sneferu combined than for the Pyramid of Khufu. How realistic is the official story about Sneferu and his 3 pyramids? Not very. By the way, maybe I did my research wrong, but I couldn't find any information about why these 3 pyramids are attributed to Sneferu in the first place. As far as I can see, this is nothing more than an unfounded assumption on the part of Egyptologists to explain why the ancient Egyptians were suddenly able to erect 6 million tons of stone structures. Anyway, what do you think is easier, building something or tearing it down? Obviously, it takes less energy to tear a structure down than to build it. The person in the picture is Sultan al-Aziz Uthman, and he ruled Egypt in the late 1100s. He personally is interesting to us because for some reason, during his reign, he decided to destroy the pyramids. It is as stupid as it sounds. He started the job, but they gave up after just 8 months. In total, they managed to break away enough stones from Menkare's pyramid, which was enough for this crevice. If that was all they had achieved in 8 months, how long would it have taken for them to dismantle the entire pyramid? According to the records, the stones that they were able to take out of the pyramid immediately began to sink as soon as they hit the sand. The question arises, how did the builders of the pyramid drag these stones across the sand without them sinking? But it's not just around the pyramids that there are oddities regarding the architectural findings of ancient Egypt. Take, for example, the statue of the Colosseum of Ozymandias at the Ramisseum. I stole this picture from Wikipedia. On the right, you can see the aforementioned statue, which is officially attributed to Pharaoh Ramses II. The statue is not in the best condition, to put it mildly. It should be known that in its heyday, this statue depicted an around 20-meter-tall sitting figure. It was carved from a single huge block of red granite and weighed around 1,000 tons. Let's compare this statue with the statues and building on the left side of the picture. If you look at the statues and the buildings on the left, you can see that those statues and columns are made of smaller stone blocks, unlike the statue of Ozymandias. Furthermore, the statue of Ozymandias, even in its overturned and fragmented state, can be said to be much more detailed and elaborate than the other statues at Ramisseum, which is strange for 2 reasons. On the one hand, the Colosseum of Ozymandias was much bigger, and therefore it was more difficult to work on. On the other hand, it was made of red granite, while the other statues, as far as I can tell, are made of limestone, which is a much softer rock, and therefore much easier to work with. Despite this, the statue of Ozymandias was more detailed and smoother. It seems to me that those who made the statue of Ozymandias are not the same as the builders of the Ramisseum. I think Ramses II built his temple there precisely because of the colossal statue that was already standing or lying there. According to historians, red granite was only mined in ancient Egypt, in the Aswan quarry, and so the stone block from which the Colossus was carved also comes from there. The only problem with this is that Aswan is about 200 kilometers as the crow flies from Luxor, where the Ramisseum is located. The question arises whether the ancient Egyptians carved the statue in Aswan and transported it to Luxor and risked damage along the way, or whether they took the stone block to Luxor, which means that they had to carry hundreds of tons more over hundreds of kilometers. The latter option sounds much more logical to me. According to historians, although opinions differ on this operation probably took place on land and not on the Nile. It seems that they also find it hard to believe that the ships of Egypt 3,200 years ago would have been able to transport loads of more than 1,000 tons. This is what a ship looks like in our time that can transport 1,000 tons. I also find it hard to imagine that members of an ancient society would transport a piece of stone weighing more than 1,000 tons over 100 kilometers across the desert. Moreover, how did they prevent the block from sinking into the sands of the desert if the Egyptian Sultanate, which was theoretically more technologically advanced, could not do this thousands of years later when they tried to demolish Menkare's pyramid? Now let's talk a little bit about the Thunderstone from Russia. The Thunderstone was found in 1768 in the territory of present-day Latvia. It got its name from the fact that, according to a legend, the rock was split from a mountain by lightning. What makes this stone interesting for us is the fact that the sculptor, Falconet, needed a pedestal for the equestrian statue of the Tsar Peter the Great, so the Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great ordered the rock to be transported from Latvia to St. Petersburg. The only problem with this was the fact that the Thunderstone at the time of transport weighed approximately 1,250 to 1,500 tons. The task was carried out by a Greek military engineer named Marinos Karbouris. Marinos had to invent a new way of transportation for the Thunderstone. The rock was laid on metal sleds, which slipped forward on bronze spheres. The process was immortalized in this contemporary drawing. 400 people worked on transporting the rock, and after developing a transport method, it took about 9 months for the rock to travel about 6 kilometers and reach the Baltic Sea. Wikipedia says that the Ozymandian Colossus could have been transported overland for about 270 kilometers before it reached Ramisseum from Asan. If this was done at the same speed as the Thunderstone was transported, then this task should have taken them 34 years. Needless to say, this is completely unrealistic. Which civilization is capable of moving a 1,000-ton rock faster? The Russian Empire at the end of the 1700s? Or ancient Egypt on the border between the Bronze and Iron Ages? I think it's the former. And what if the Egyptians used a ship to transport the Colossus? Well, after the stone reached the coast of the Baltic Sea, the Russians built a special cargo ship on the spot, which was solely designed to transport the stone. This ship had to be supported on both sides by 2 warships so that it would not accidentally capsize. And this is how the Thunderstone finally reached St. Petersburg, where it can be seen today as a pedestal for the equestrian statue of Peter the Great. The delivery of the Thunderstone took 2 years from start to finish. Based on this, it seems to me that transporting such a large piece of stone by ship is not much easier than by land. It doesn't seem very realistic to me that the ancient Egyptians could have solved this problem, so the answer to me is official. The Colossus of Ozymandias is not the work of the ancient Egyptians. They just found it lying in the desert. Speaking of the 1,000-ton pieces of stone, what you see now is the unfinished obelisk in the Aswan quarry. According to estimates, if the obelisk had been completed, it would have weighed around 1,000 to 1,200 tons. It was not finished probably because it cracked during quarrying. For me, the most interesting details on the obelisk are the uniform depressions. Officially, these traces were created when the ancient Egyptians used these dolerite stones to excavate the obelisk by tapping or rubbing them against the granite. And this is not a joke. This is really the official explanation. I also find it really hard to believe that workers could effectively work in these narrow trenches using the method I just described, especially in the parts underneath the obelisk. And I find it even harder to believe that they can excavate the obelisk with this method in a lifetime. It is also unimaginable to me that this method would leave such beautiful, uniform marks. These marks are so identical that I think they could only have been left by some kind of machine. I mean, just look at this picture. If you didn't know this mark was done by the ancient Egyptians, you'd think these tracks were carved by some modern industrial quarrying machine. But if this obelisk was not made by the ancient Egyptians, then what about the others? Regarding the smaller obelisks, I can imagine that the ancient Egyptians copied the ones they found in their country. But the bigger ones, in the light of what can be seen in the Aswan quarry, I consider to be out of the question. We know of less than 30 Egyptian obelisks that have survived, most of which are in Rome, because when the Romans conquered Egypt, they took several obelisks to Rome by ship. The largest of these is the Lateran obelisk, which in its heyday may have weighed 400 tons, and I know I said earlier that it was impossible for the ancient Egyptians to have moved 1,000-ton stones, so how could the Romans have moved 400-ton stones? Well, they were probably rolled, but this happened 1,000 years after these obelisks were officially created by the ancient Egyptians. Moreover, the biggest obelisk that the Romans took away is not even half as big as the one in Aswan. The Lateran obelisk was found in 3 pieces in the 16th century, so it's possible that Romans cut it up in Egypt so that they could actually move it to Rome. The question arose in my mind, if the Romans were more advanced than the Egyptians whom the obelisks are attributed to, why would they bother to transport them across the sea for hundreds of kilometers? Wouldn't it have been easier to manufacture them in Rome? Or maybe they just weren't capable of it. By the way, all the obelisks in Rome, with one exception, were found during excavations in pieces during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, and all of them were erected to their current position then. The installation of the obelisks in the early modern period is relatively well documented, by which I mean that several drawings of the process were made at the time. The commissioners of the obelisks were later identified by historians based on the hieroglyphs found on them. For example, the text on the Theodosius obelisk in Istanbul celebrates the victory of Pharaoh Thutmose III over the Mitanni. However, not all obelisks have inscriptions. For example, the obelisk in the main square of the Vatican does not have any hieroglyphs that could be used to identify who commissioned it and why. Could it be possible that the hieroglyphs on these obelisks were only subsequently engraved by the pharaohs of Egypt after they were found? Obelisks can be found not only in Egypt, but also in today's Ethiopia, more precisely in the city of Aksum, where 2 huge 160 and 170-ton faunolite columns still stand to this day. Historians place their time of origin in the 4th century, and they believe that they were commissioned by the king of Aksum. However, no records have survived which would indicate that this would be the case, nor are there any engravings aside from on the fake doors and windows. Nothing could be found on the obelisks themselves which could be used to identify their place of origin, so this is nothing more than pure speculation. Next to the 2 obelisks, there is also a third one in Aksum, which is broken into pieces. This obelisk may have weighed more than 500 tons while it was still in one piece. It is worth looking at this picture to see how much more primitive the technology supporting the fallen obelisk looks compared to the obelisk itself. In addition to the pyramids, obelisks, and 1,000-ton statues, there are countless archaeological finds in Egypt that seems too advanced for an ancient Bronze Age society to have made them. But if I would talk about them, this video would be 10 hours long, so let's move on and let's get away from Egypt. An archipelago of about 100 artificial islands called Nan Madol is located at banks of the island of Pohnpei in Micronesia. This artificial archipelago and the walls of it, which in some places reaches 10 meters, were built from huge basalt columns weighing several tons. Some basalt columns weigh close to 100 tons, according to estimates. The entire structure was built from about 750,000 to 870,000 tons of basalt. Nan Madol was already found abandoned by the European explorers. The local tribes simply referred to it as a ghost town. According to their legends, Nan Madol was built by 2 wizards, Olashipa and Olasopa, who came from the west on a huge ship, and they simply levitated the basalt columns in place with their magic. However, according to academia, Nan Madol was built by the local natives in about 4 centuries between 1200 and 1600, meaning that around 2,000 tons of basalt columns were put in place every year. Well, this raised a few questions for me. First of all, why would anyone build artificial islands in Micronesia? Secondly, Nan Madol is not that big. It covers an area of less than 1 square kilometer. I can imagine a big city that has been built continuously for 400 years, but somehow I find it hard to believe that the local natives have been cutting and carrying basalt columns weighing several tons for centuries without much results to show for it. One would think that if they were really to put their heads into something like this, they would have given up after 1 or 2 months. If Nan Madol was truly built by the natives between the 13th and 17th centuries, then that means that most of the columns had to be placed underwater. Somehow I find it hard to believe that that would be something they would waste their time on, or that they were even capable of. In the section of Ancient Aliens dealing with Nan Madol, it is stated that 250 million tons of basalt were used for its construction. That's 310 times as much as the official estimates. Since I am not qualified or in a position to make an educated guess regarding the weight of the basalt used for Nan Madol, I decided to compare it with something similar from modern times. The world archipelago, which represents the Earth, was artificially built in the 2000s off the coast of Dubai in an area of approximately 54 square kilometers, so it's about 67 times larger than Nan Madol. On the Wikipedia page of the world archipelago, it is written that 368 million tons of stone were used to build it, which is 460 times the weight of what was officially used to build Nan Madol. If proportionally as much stone was used for Nan Madol as the world archipelago, then the weight of the stone used for Nan Madol should be about 5.5 million tons, which is about 7 times as much as the official estimate. Considering that Nan Madol, unlike the rest of the world, is built entirely of stone, and that the basalt is one of the heaviest types of rock, I wouldn't be surprised if the weight of basalt used for Nan Madol is well over the 5.5 million tons, albeit, who knows, maybe the official estimate is accurate. After all, Nan Madol could have been built in much shallower water. One very interesting thing about the world archipelago and Nan Madol, that although the world archipelago was built with the most modern technology, designed by the best engineers, the archipelago is sinking according to some news. In contrast, Nan Madol was built centuries ago by a small native Polynesian tribe, yet it still stands today. I wonder if the builders of the world archipelago could have built it using giant basalt columns similar to what we can find in Nan Madol, using the technology and the resources available to them. Something tells me that they couldn't. If I had to guess, I would say that Nan Madol was originally built entirely on land and got submerged later. In my opinion, it looks quite strange for an artificial island. It's like some half-sunken city, or more precisely a village, or the walls of a building complex. If I'm right, that means Nan Madol was built before the sea level rose at the end of the last ice age more than 10,000 years ago. But let's move on. I think we barely talk about big stones, so for a change, let's talk about big stones. The city of Baalbek is located in Lebanon. The city is primarily known for the remains of an ancient Roman temple complex which lives there, where we can find 3 huge stones that are called the Baalbek trilithon, each of which weighs 800 tons individually. Many people, myself included, think that the foundation of the temple complex was built a long time ago, long before the Romans found it and used it as a base for their own temple. Aside from the enormous dimensions and weight of the trilithon, and the fact that this is the only Roman ruins where stones this size could be found, this is usually supported by 2 other facts. The first, if you look at this picture, it looks like the pedestal was built in 2 separate phases. I marked this line here on the picture with red. The second fact is that during excavations, at an ancient quarry 800 meters from the trilithon, 3 more huge blocks of stone were found, 2 of which were not yet fully excavated from the quarry. We are talking about a 1,000-ton, a 1,250-ton, and a 1,650-ton stone block. If you look at the pedestal, you can see that the smaller stones are at the bottom, and then as we move up, they get bigger and bigger until this process stops at the trilithon. The larger stones that were found in the quarry would have probably been put at the top of the trilithon. According to mainstream academia, after placing 3 800-ton stones on the platform, the Romans extracted a 1,000-ton stone and began to extract another 1,250 and 1,650 ton stones after realizing that the 1,000-ton stones were simply too much for them to handle and that they could no longer use them for the building of the temple complex. They simply decided to leave them there. This doesn't make much sense. It's more likely that the Romans had no idea that these 3 giant stones were even buried in the ground not far from the Trilithon. If that's the case, then the Romans weren't the ones who excavated it and placed the Trilithons either. By the way, the largest unexcavated stone blocks that we know of are not in Baalbek, but in the Yangshan quarry in China. They weigh around 6,000, 8,800, and 12,000 tons. The order to excavate the stones was officially issued in the early 1400s by the Chinese Emperor Yongle. As far as I know, there is literally no evidence for this. Historians theorize that the Chinese realized during excavation that there was no way they would be able to move those monoliths, so they stopped midway. The idea that the Chinese engineers wouldn't know that they couldn't be able to move a monolith weighing 12,000 tons is as ridiculous as it sounds. Here's something I noticed while working on this video. Do you see these depressions in the side of the monoliths? These were excavated in order to separate the stones from the ground, and then presumably the resulting support columns would have been sawed off and then lifted somehow. In one of his videos, the YouTuber Wandering Wolf visited the site and entered one of these caves. If you look here at the back wall right next to Wandering Wolf, you can see these uniform depression marks, which just happen to look exactly like the spoon marks found on the Aswan obelisk. Another oddity is these knob-like protrusions on the side of one of the monoliths. Similar knobs can be found on several ancient structures, for example on the stones covering the remains of the Menkaure pyramid, or on the so-called Cyclopean walls preserved all across the world archipelago. The main feature of these walls is that they consist of huge interlocking stones and can be found all over the world, for example in Greece, Japan, Peru, Chile, Albania, India, just to name a few examples. If we were actually capable of building structures that didn't collapse by themselves, and human civilization were to restart tomorrow, then the people 1,000 years later would find ruins of similar-looking skyscrapers everywhere. That's why we can find ruins of the same kind of walls all over the world. And this is why I wouldn't be surprised if the Bosnian pyramids were real, or if the Ratanj mountain in Serbia would turn out to be a pyramid as well. The thing is, we live in a post-apocalyptic world. I could go on and give a lot more examples of ancient architectural artifacts which surpass our current abilities, but this video is already the longest I've ever made, and so I think I've managed to get my point across. If you've made it to the end of this video and are still interested in the topic, I recommend the YouTube channels of Jimmy Corsetti, Brian Forrester, Uncharted X, and Curious Being, who delve way deeper into the topic than I did here. You can find the link to those channels in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.